September 10th, 1777. The atmosphere in the isolated frontier settlement of Oak Haven, buried deep within Pennsylvania's wilderness, carried the scent of smoldering foliage and approaching autumn's bite. It was ordinary. Women worked butter churns, men repaired fence lines, children pursued each other through dusty passages between rough-hewn timber dwellings. It was delicate equilibrium, a temporary fantasy of normalcy in a world ripping itself apart. Then a horse materialized on the horizon, a solitary rider pushing his mount beyond its limits, a dark spot against September's brilliant blue expanse. He wasn't riding like someone returning from a hunting expedition. He was riding like someone pursued by hell itself. The rider was a scout named Vance, and the intelligence he transported was far worse than any demon. He collapsed from his mount, his face pale with exhaustion and terror, his words tumbling out in breathless flood. A force of 500 men was approaching. 500. A combination of British regulars in their despised scarlet coats, loyalist militia who knew the terrain as intimately as they did, and their Native American Confederates, masters of silent, invisible warfare. They were less than 5 days distant, and they were heading directly toward Oak Haven. 500 men against a settlement of 80 able-bodied militia, most of them cultivators and metal workers, not warriors. The mathematics was simple. It was an execution sentence. Panic spread through the settlement like pestilence. Men seized their muskets. Women gathered their offspring, their faces masks of horror. The immediate instinct was flight, to flee into wilderness, to abandon everything they had constructed. Yet there was no time. The enemy was too close, the wilderness too vast, the approaching winter too merciless. In the midst of chaos, one man stood perfectly motionless. Captain Samuel Whitmore, 42 years old, a former engineer in the British Army who had fought in the French and Indian War 2 decades earlier. He was someone who had witnessed war's face, who comprehended its brutal geometry, its unforgiving logic. He had settled on the frontier to escape that world, to construct a life of tranquility. Yet that world had followed him here. As the settlers debated their hopeless options, Whitmore stared at the open field east of the settlement, the direction from which the enemy would arrive. He wasn't seeing a field. He was seeing a kill zone. He was seeing angles, lines of fire, and a trap. He raised his voice, a calm, steady baritone that cut through the noise of panic. "We will not run," he said. "We will fight, and we will win." The settlers stared at him as though he were insane. Win against 500 men? How? Whitmore pointed to the field. "We will build a wall," he said. A few men nodded. A log wall, a palisade, was the standard frontier defense. It was something they understood. Yet then Whitmore added a detail that made no sense, a detail that seemed to defy all logic, all common sense, all the known rules of frontier warfare. "We will not build it straight," he said, his eyes fixed on the field, his mind already calculating angles and distances. "We will build it with a 90-degree angle, a corner right in the middle. How can 80 men stop a force of 500? How can a simple log wall built in the wrong shape, a shape that seems to invite attack, possibly stand against a trained army?" This is the story of a militia captain who remembered a forgotten piece of military geometry, a man who saw a weapon where others saw only a weakness. This is the story of how a 90-degree angle, a simple corner, became one of the most brutally effective traps in the history of the American frontier. Samuel Whitmore was a man caught between two worlds. He had been born and raised in England, the son of a stonemason who had taught him the principles of geometry and construction. He had joined the British Army as a young man, not as a soldier, but as an engineer, a man who built bridges and forts and siege works. He had served in the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763, a brutal, bloody conflict that had taught him the realities of warfare in the American wilderness. He had learned from the best, from the European military engineers who brought the science of fortification to the New World. He had studied the works of the great French engineer Vauban, the man who had revolutionized the art of siege warfare. He had learned about bastions, those star-shaped projections from fort walls that allowed for flanking fire, that eliminated blind spots, that created a web of interlocking fields of fire that could decimate an attacking force. He understood that a fort was not just a wall, it was a machine for killing. Vauban's principles were simple yet profound. A straight wall was a death trap for defenders. It created blind spots, areas where attackers could mass without being seen, areas where they could use ladders or axes to breach the wall without taking fire. Yet an angled wall, a wall with projections and corners, eliminated those blind spots. It allowed defenders to fire along the length of the wall, to catch attackers in a crossfire, to create overlapping fields of fire that left no safe space, no place to hide. Whitmore had seen these principles in action during the siege of Fort William Henry in 1757, where he had served as a junior engineer. He had watched as French forces led by the Marquis de Montcalm had used their superior knowledge of siege warfare to systematically reduce British defenses. He had seen how French engineers had positioned their artillery to exploit blind spots in British fortifications, how they had used geometry as a weapon, how they had turned the very shape of the fort against its defenders. Yet he had also learned from the other side. He had seen how Native American warriors used terrain as a weapon, how they moved like phantoms through forest, how they used speed and surprise and psychological warfare to defeat larger, better-equipped forces. He had seen how American colonial militia, with their long rifles and their frontier skills, could be a formidable fighting force if properly led. He had learned that warfare in American wilderness was not about grand formations and textbook tactics. It was about adaptation, about using what you had, about turning your weaknesses into strengths. After the war, disillusioned with the British Army and its rigid hierarchies, Whitmore had resigned his commission and settled on the Pennsylvania frontier. He had married a woman named Sarah, the daughter of a local farmer, and they had built a small cabin on the edge of Oak Haven. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and Whitmore had tried to leave his past behind, to become just another farmer scratching a living from unforgiving soil. Yet his knowledge, his experience, his reputation as someone who understood war's geometry had followed him. When the Revolutionary War erupted in 1775, the men of Oak Haven had elected him captain of the local militia, a position he accepted with a heavy heart. He had seen enough of war. He knew its cost, its brutality, its capacity to destroy everything it touched. Yet he also knew that if he refused, if he turned his back on his neighbors, they would die. And he could not live with that. Now in September of 1777, war had come to his doorstep, and he knew that standard frontier tactics, the straight log wall, the simple palisade, would be a death trap. A straight wall could be overwhelmed by a force of 500 men. They would simply charge it, absorb the first volley, then use their numbers to swarm over the top. The defenders would be slaughtered. He needed an advantage, a force multiplier, a way to make his 80 men fight like 800. And he found it in the memory of a Vauban-style bastion, in the simple, elegant, deadly geometry of a 90-degree angle. He gathered the men of the militia in the settlement center, using a piece of charcoal to sketch his plan in the dirt. He drew 2 walls, each about 100 yards long, meeting at a right angle like the letter L. The open side of the L would face. The settlement in the corner, the 90-degree angle, would point directly at the approaching enemy. "This is madness, Captain," said a blacksmith named Miller, a big, powerful man who was respected by the others. "You're giving them a corner to hide behind. They'll use it for cover, and they'll pick us off one by one." "That's what they'll think," Whitmore replied, his voice calm and confident. "They will see a weakness, a mistake, an amateur fortification, and they will attack it. They will charge right into the angle, and that's when the trap will spring." He drew more lines in the dirt, showing how the men on each wall would be able to fire not just straight ahead, but across the front of the other wall. He explained the concept of flanking fire, of creating a crossfire, a kill zone where the enemy would be caught between 2 converging lines of fire, with no cover, no escape. "If you've ever been caught in a crossfire," he said, looking each man in the eye, "you know that there is nothing more terrifying. It's a storm of lead from 2 directions at once. You don't know which way to turn, which way to run. You just die." He explained that the corner, the 90-degree angle that looked like a weakness, was actually the key to the entire defense. It would funnel the enemy into the kill zone. It would force them to bunch up, to become a dense, easy target. And it would protect the defenders, who would be firing from behind the cover of the log walls, their bodies shielded from the enemy's return fire. He used sticks to demonstrate the concept, placing them at right angles to each other. "Watch," he said, and he had 2 men stand behind the sticks, pointing their fingers like muskets. "Now imagine a man charging into this corner. He takes fire from here," he pointed to one wall, "and from here, he pointed to the other. He's exposed from 2 sides. He has nowhere to go. He's dead." The men stared at the demonstration, their faces slowly changing from skepticism to understanding. They could see it now. They could see how the geometry would work, how the angle would turn the enemy's charge into slaughter. It was a brilliant, counterintuitive plan, a plan that took the enemy's expectations and used them as weapons. Yet it was also a huge gamble. It required perfect execution, perfect discipline, and a level of trust that was hard to come by in the frontier, where men were fiercely independent and suspicious of authority. For a long moment, the men were silent, staring at the strange L-shaped drawing in the dirt. They were being asked to abandon everything they knew about frontier warfare, to put their lives and the lives of their families in the hands of a man with a crazy idea about geometry. It was a leap of faith, a leap into the unknown. Then the blacksmith Miller, the man who had been most vocal in his opposition, slowly nodded. "I don't understand it, Captain," he said, his voice a low rumble, "but I trust you. If you say this is the way, then this is the way." That was the turning point. With Miller on his side, the rest of the men followed. The debate was over. The work had begun. They had 5 days, 120 hours, to build a fortress out of nothing but logs and earth and sweat and fear. The enemy was coming. The clock was ticking. September 11th, 1777. The work began at dawn, a frantic, desperate race against time. The entire settlement was mobilized. Every man, every woman, every child old enough to carry a piece of wood was put to work. The men, led by Whitmore and Miller, headed into forest with their axes, felling trees with speed and efficiency born of desperation. The sound of their axes echoed through the valley, a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of defiance. They chose oak and hickory trees, hardwoods that could stand up to musket fire, trees that were at least a foot in diameter. They needed hundreds of them, enough to build 2 walls, each one 100 yards long and 8 feet high. The work was brutal, backbreaking, relentless. The men worked in shifts from dawn until dusk, their hands blistered and bleeding, their muscles screaming in protest. Yet they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Whitmore had calculated that they would need approximately 240 logs to complete the walls. Each log would be roughly 10 feet long, allowing for 2 feet to be buried in the ground for stability. The walls would be 8 feet high above ground, a height that was tall enough to provide cover, but not so tall that it would be impossible to build in the time they had. As the men felled the trees, the women and children used draft horses and oxen to drag the logs to the building site, the open field east of the settlement. It was a slow, arduous process, the heavy logs digging furrows in soft earth, the animals straining against their harnesses. The children, some as young as 10, worked alongside their mothers, their small faces grim with premature understanding of the stakes. Whitmore was everywhere at once, a whirlwind of motion and energy. He was in the forest, showing the men how to fell trees with the fewest number of cuts. He was at the building site, using his engineer's eye to lay out the precise 90-degree angle of the walls, using stakes and lengths of rope to create a perfect corner. He was with the women and children, organizing the transport of the logs, making sure the work flowed smoothly without any wasted time or effort. He was a man transformed, his quiet, reserved demeanor replaced by fiery intensity, a sense of purpose that was contagious. He was no longer just a farmer, a husband, a father. He was a commander, a leader, a man who held the fate of his people in his hands, and he would not fail them. By the end of the first day, they had felled over 100 trees and had laid out the foundation of the walls, a shallow trench dug into earth. It was small beginning, tiny scratch on the face of the land. Yet it was a start. It was hope. September 12th, the second day, the first logs were laid in place, the massive, heavy timbers lifted by teams of men, their muscles straining, their faces contorted with effort. Whitmore showed them how to interlock the logs at the corner, creating strong, stable joint that would be the anchor of the entire structure. He used a technique called a saddle notch, a semicircular cut in the underside of each log that allowed it to fit snugly over the log below it. It was simple, effective technique. A technique that had been used to build log cabins on frontier for 100 years. Yet it had never been used like this, to create a weapon of war. The corner was the most critical part of the entire structure. If it failed, if the logs shifted or separated under the impact of enemy fire, the entire defense would collapse. Whitmore spent hours at the corner, personally inspecting each notch, each joint, making sure that the logs were perfectly aligned, that the structure was solid and stable. As the walls began to rise, a new sense of urgency took hold. The men could see the shape of the fortress taking form, the strange L-shaped structure that would be their only hope. They worked with renewed sense of purpose, grim determination that was fueled by fear and by growing belief in Whitmore's plan. September 13th, the third day, the walls were now 4 feet high, a solid barrier of wood and earth. They began to cut firing ports into the logs, small, narrow openings just big enough to poke a musket through. Whitmore was meticulous about the placement of the ports, angling them so that they would provide maximum field of fire, so that every inch of ground in front of the walls could be covered by a storm of lead. He created a web of interlocking fields of fire, a death trap for anyone who dared to enter the angle. He positioned the firing ports at different heights, some at chest level for standing shooters, some at knee level for kneeling shooters. This would allow the militia to maintain continuous rate of fire, with one rank firing while the other reloaded. It was a technique he had learned from the British Army, a technique that had been used to devastating effect in European warfare for centuries. That evening, a scout returned with more news. The enemy was closer than they had thought, less than 2 days away. And the force was even larger than the first report had indicated. Not just 500 men, but closer to 600. The news was body blow, a wave of despair that threatened to overwhelm them. 600 men. The odds were impossible, insurmountable. Yet Whitmore refused to let them give in to fear. He gathered the men around the rising walls, the firelight casting long dancing shadows on their exhausted faces. "Let them come," he said, his voice ringing with confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Let them all come. This wall is not just wood and earth, it is a machine designed to kill, and tomorrow we will turn it on." September 14th, the fourth day, the final push. They worked through the day and into the night, their bodies numb with exhaustion, their minds focused on a single goal: finish the wall. They raised the walls to their full height of 8 feet, a formidable barrier that seemed to rise from earth itself. They reinforced the walls with dirt, piling it up against the base of the logs to create a thick earthen rampart that would absorb the impact of cannonballs if the enemy had them. They built a small raised platform behind the walls, a firing step that would allow the men to shoot over the top of the logs. Whitmore also had them dig a shallow ditch in front of the walls, about 3 feet deep and 6 feet wide. The dirt from the ditch was piled up against the base of the walls, further reinforcing them. The ditch would slow down any charging enemy, forcing them to scramble down and then up the other side, making them easy targets for the defenders. As the work continued, Whitmore's wife, Sarah, and the other women prepared supplies for the coming battle. They made bandages from torn sheets. They filled water barrels. They cooked food that could be eaten cold. They molded lead balls for the muskets. They worked in silence, their faces grim, their hands steady. They knew what was coming. They knew the price of failure. By dawn on September 15th, it was done. The fortress was complete. A strange L-shaped structure of raw, unpeeled logs sitting in the middle of an open field, pointing like an accusing finger at the eastern horizon. It was a crude, ugly thing, a scar on the face of the land. Yet it was their only hope. As the first rays of sun broke over the horizon, a sentry on the wall let out a cry. "They're here." They appeared as a dark line on the horizon, a line that grew steadily larger, resolving itself into columns of men marching in perfect formation. Their red coats splashed blood against the green of the fields. The sound of their drums, a steady, relentless beat, rolled across the valley like a wave of thunder. 600 men. A professional army comes to crush small, defiant settlements of farmers and blacksmiths. Captain Samuel Whitmore stood on the firing step, his long rifle in his hands, his eyes fixed on the approaching enemy. He had done all he could. He had built his machine. Now it was time to see if it would work. September 15th, 1777. Dawn. The air was cold and still, the silence broken only by the steady, rhythmic beat of British drums, a sound that was both promise and threat. From his position on the firing step, Captain Samuel Whitmore watched the enemy advance, a river of red and white flowing across green fields. 600 men moving with disciplined precision of professional army. They were beautiful, terrible sights. He looked at his own men, the 80 farmers and blacksmiths and trappers who stood beside him, their faces pale in morning light, their knuckles white as they gripped their muskets. They were terrified. He could see it in their eyes, in the way they shifted their feet, in the way they swallowed. their throats dry with fear. They were not soldiers. They were ordinary men pushed to extraordinary moment. He knew that the next few minutes would be critical. He had to hold them together. He had to make them believe. He walked along the firing step, his voice low and steady, speaking to each man by name, reminding them of what they were fighting for, their homes, their families, their lives. "Hold your fire," he said, his voice calm, steady anchor in the storm of their fear. "Hold your fire until I give the word. Trust the wall. Trust the geometry. Trust me." In the British lines, Major Alistair Finch, a veteran of a dozen European campaigns, surveyed the American position through his spyglass. He saw the strange L-shaped wall of raw logs, and he smiled, a thin, cruel smile of contempt. "Amateurs," he said to his second in command, a young lieutenant named Ashford. "They built their own tomb. They've given us a corner to use as cover. We'll pin them down with half our force and then flank them from the other side. It will be over in an hour." Lieutenant Ashford, less experienced but more cautious, studied the fortification with a frown. "Sir, that angle, it seems deliberate. What if it's a trap?" Major Finch laughed. Harsh, barking sound. "A trap? By colonial farmers? Don't be absurd, Ashford. They don't have the training, the knowledge, or the discipline to build proper fortifications. This is the work of frightened men who don't know what they're doing. We will crush them." He gave the order to advance. The drums beat faster. The redcoats quickened their pace, their bayonets glittering in the morning sun. They were confident, arrogant, sure of their victory. They saw a crude, poorly designed fortification, testament to the incompetence of colonial militia. They didn't see the trap. They came on, a wave of red and white, their battle cries echoing across the valley. They headed straight for the corner, the 90-degree angle, just as Whitmore had predicted. They saw it as the weakest point, the place where they could concentrate their forces and break through the American line. Whitmore watched them come, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind cold, clear instrument of calculation. He waited and waited. The enemy was now 100 yards away, 80 yards, 60. He could see the faces of the men in the front rank, their mouths open as they shouted their battle cries, their eyes wide with the thrill of the charge. 50 yards, 40. The ground was shaking with the thunder of their boots. 30 yards. "Now," he said, his voice low, almost conversational. "Fire." 80 muskets roared as one, a single deafening clap of thunder that rolled across valley. A cloud of white smoke erupted from the log wall, obscuring the American position. The front rank of the British charge disappeared, consumed by a storm of lead. Men screamed and fell and died. Yet this was just the beginning. This was just the first volley. The real trap was about to spring. As British soldiers in the second rank pushed forward, stepping over the bodies of their fallen comrades, they found themselves funneled into the angle, the space between the two 90-degree walls. They were packed together, shoulder to shoulder, a dense, writhing mass of men. And then the second volley came, not from the front, but from the side, from the other wall, the wall they had ignored. It was devastating, enfilading fire, a storm of lead that tore through their ranks from the flank, ripping them apart. Men who had been focused on the enemy in front of them were suddenly hit from the side, their bodies jerking and twisting as musket balls slammed into them. The crossfire that Whitmore had designed, the kill zone he had envisioned, was now reality. Brutal, bloody, inescapable reality. The British soldiers were trapped. They couldn't advance because the men in front of them were falling, blocking their path. They couldn't retreat because the men behind them were pushing them forward. They couldn't take cover because there was no cover to be had. They were caught in a meat grinder, a storm of lead from two directions at once. The beautiful, disciplined lines of the British Army dissolved into a chaotic, screaming mob of terrified men. Major Finch, watching from the rear, could not believe what he was seeing. His men were being slaughtered. His perfect textbook charge had turned into disaster. He had underestimated his enemy. He had misread the battlefield. He had fallen into a trap. He was a proud man, a man who had never known defeat. He would not be outsmarted by a colonial farmer. He would not be beaten by a crude log wall. He made a decision, desperate, reckless decision, that would seal his fate. "Cavalry!" he screamed, his voice hoarse with rage and disbelief. "Charge them! Break their line!" 100 horsemen, the elite of his force, spurred their mounts forward, their sabers drawn, their faces set in grim determination. They were a thunderous, terrifying sight, a wave of horseflesh and steel that was designed to break the will of any infantry line. They charged straight for the angle, for the heart of the American position. Whitmore saw them coming, a storm on the horizon. He knew that this was the moment of truth. If the cavalry broke through, his men would be slaughtered. The wall would be overrun. The battle would be lost. "Steady," he roared, his voice cutting through the din of battle. "Hold your fire. Wait for the command." He waited until the cavalry was just 30 yards away, their horses' hooves thundering on hard-packed earth, their sabers flashing in the sun. He could see the riders' faces, their eyes wide with mixture of excitement and bloodlust. They were so close he could smell the sweat of their horses, could hear the jingle of their harnesses, could see the foam on horses' mouths. 20 yards, 15, 10. "Now!" he screamed. "Fire!" Another volley, this one aimed low at the horses, not the riders. The effect was devastating. Horses screamed and fell, their legs shot out from under them, their bodies crashing to ground in tangle of flailing limbs. Riders were thrown from their saddles, their bodies crushed by their falling mounts or impaled on their own sabers. The charge dissolved into chaotic, screaming pileup of men and horses, all of them trapped in narrow confines of the angle, all of them exposed to relentless, withering fire from the log walls. The men on the walls reloaded and fired, their movements mechanical, their faces blank with horror of what they were doing. They were not warriors, they were not killers. Yet in that moment they were a machine for death, and they did their work with terrible, efficient precision. It was slaughter, massacre, testament to brutal, unforgiving geometry of war. Major Finch watched in horror, his face ashen, his body trembling with mixture of rage and despair. He had lost. He had been beaten by a farmer, by a wall, by a 90-degree angle. He had thrown away the lives of his men, the best soldiers in the British Army, because of his arrogance, his contempt for his enemy, his failure to see the trap that had been laid for him. He gave the order to retreat. The British Army, what was left of it, broke and ran, a disorganized, terrified mob fleeing for their lives. They left behind over 200 of their comrades, their bodies piled up in the angle, a gruesome monument to the folly of arrogance and the power of a simple, brilliant idea. In American lines, ragged cheer went up, a sound of disbelief and relief and triumph. They had done it. They had won. 80 men had defeated 600. They had faced impossible odds, and they had prevailed. Captain Samuel Whitmore leaned against the log wall, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline, his face streaked with gunpowder and sweat. He looked at the carnage in front of him, the field of red and white, the bodies of men and horses. And he felt no joy, no triumph, only deep, profound sadness. He had built a machine for killing, and it had worked all too well. He had saved his people. He had won a great victory. Yet he knew that war was far from over. and that the geometry of death would be part of his life for a long time to come. The news of the victory at Oak Haven spread like wildfire through the Pennsylvania frontier. It was a story told and retold around campfires and in taverns, a story that grew with each telling until it became legend. The story of the militia captain who had outsmarted a British major. The story of 80 farmers who had defeated 600 regulars. The story of the strange L-shaped wall that had turned certain defeat into stunning victory. Military men from the Continental Army came to Oak Haven to see the fortification for themselves, to study its design, to understand the principles behind its success. They saw what Whitmore had seen, what the British had failed to see until it was too late. They saw the power of the 90-degree angle, the simple, elegant genius of the crossfire, and the brutal effectiveness of the kill zone. One of those visitors was a young colonel named Daniel Morgan, a veteran of the frontier wars who would go on to become one of the most successful American commanders of the Revolutionary War. He spent 2 days at Oak Haven, walking the walls, measuring the angles, and talking to Whitmore about the principles of flanking fire and interlocking fields of fire. He took those lessons with him, and he used them to devastating effect at the Battle of Cowpens in 1781, where he would employ a similar double envelopment tactic to destroy the British force under command of Banastre Tarleton. The Whitmore Wall, as it came to be known, was copied and adapted in other frontier forts throughout Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Carolinas. It became standard defensive design, a new and valuable addition to American art of war. Settlements that had been vulnerable to attack now had fighting chance, a way to defend themselves against larger, better-equipped forces. And here's the wild part, the part that connects this 18th century battle to our own time. The principles that Captain Samuel Whitmore used to defend his small settlement are the same principles that are still used in military tactics and defensive architecture today. The concept of interlocking fields of fire, of creating kill zones, of using the geometry of the battlefield to gain tactical advantage, these are timeless principles of warfare. You can see them in the design of modern military bases, where guard towers are positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, where walls are angled to eliminate blind spots, where every inch of perimeter can be covered by defensive fire. You can see them in the layout of urban combat positions, where soldiers use corners and angles to create ambush zones, to funnel enemy forces into kill zones. You can see them in the way that police and SWAT teams clear a room, using the geometry of the space to control the movement of suspects, to create safe zones and danger zones. The tools have changed. We have machine guns and night vision goggles and drones and thermal imaging. Yet the geometry remains the same. A 90-degree angle is still one of the most effective ways to control space, to dominate an enemy, to win a fight. The principles that Vauban developed in the 17th century, that Whitmore applied on the Pennsylvania frontier in the 18th century, are still being taught in military academies around the world today. Samuel Whitmore was promoted to the rank of major in the Continental Army, and he served with distinction for the rest of the war. He fought at the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, where he commanded a regiment of Pennsylvania militia. He fought at the Siege of Yorktown in 1781, where he served as engineer, helping to design the siege works that would force Cornwallis to surrender. He never became a famous general. His name is not remembered in history books alongside Washington and Greene and Lafayette. Yet his legacy, the legacy of the man who understood the geometry of war, lived on. It lived on in the forts that were built using his design, in the battles that were won using his tactics, in the lives that were saved by his strange, brilliant idea. It lived on in the men he trained, the officers he mentored, the soldiers who learned from him the simple, powerful truth that warfare is not just about courage and strength, but about knowledge and intelligence and the ability to see the battlefield, not as it is, but as it could be. He returned to Oak Haven after the war, a quiet, unassuming hero. He went back to his farm, to his family, to the life of peace he had fought so hard to defend. He rarely spoke of the battle, of the day he had turned the field into a killing machine. It was a memory he carried with him, a burden and source of pride, a reminder of the terrible, beautiful, unforgiving logic of war. He lived to the age of 73, dying peacefully in his bed at 1808, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. He was buried in the small cemetery on the edge of Oak Haven, under a simple stone marker that read, Captain Samuel Whitmore, Patriot and Engineer, 1735-1808. The L-shaped wall stood for another 50 years, a monument to his ingenuity and his courage. It was eventually torn down in the 1820s, when the threat of frontier warfare had passed, when the land was safe and settled and the need for such defenses was gone. Yet the memory of it, the story of it, lived on. His story is testament to the power of knowledge, the importance of unconventional thinking, and the simple, brutal fact that sometimes the fate of hundreds can rest on the vision of a single man. A man who saw not just a wall, but a weapon. Not just a corner, but a trap. A man who understood that in the right hands, with the right knowledge, a 90-degree angle could be the deadliest thing on the battlefield.